Hello and welcome to the race edition of the Race Weekend's data analysis for the Austrian Grand Prix. I do apologise for the slight delay, the one-day delay to this episode, but it is here nonetheless. Now this is the series in which we compile all of the race data. We look at positional charts, clean air lap running, teammate comparisons, all of the good, juicy data in good graph form. Everything is timestamped in the description down below, so feel free to skip to whichever section of the video you would like me to talk about. But without further ado, let us jump on into the race data for the Austrian Grand Prix. And we begin with yet another boring positional table. Max Verstappen leading every single lap. And around lap 52, where Hamilton had to take his second pit stop, he loses those 2 places to Bottas and Norris. There's a bunch of pit stops in the early phase of the Grand Prix, laps 12 to 16, and then again from about laps 28 through to 34. But other than that, a really uneventful positions table. So we'll take a look at the lap time chart overall, and this is a little bit more boring than what we saw in Styria. We can see the first round of pit stops for those drivers that started on the soft compound of tyres. We can then see the middle portion of pit stops, the final portion of pit stops, and then a fastest lap pit stop as well, who I believe that was Lewis Hamilton and also Max Verstappen, who both stopped at the very end. But now just taking a zoomed in detailed look at the main portion of running, excluding all of the pit stops, we get something that looks a bit like this. And then by these blue arrows, first of all, that we can highlight are the 3 individual bands of racing. I am putting Max Verstappen in a band of his own. For the first stint, that is, on the medium compound of tyre, he was rapid, about half a second quicker than anybody else. And anybody else was Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez, who they themselves were about 2 seconds to a second per lap faster than everybody else. So in this first stint, Max Verstappen just waltzed away with this victory. Then by the green arrows, we have it's pretty much all identical. Everyone's all pretty much running at the same pace. We definitely have a quick band down at the bottom green arrow, and then we definitely have a middle band, and possibly you could identify that slower band at the top. Not 100% sure. And then exactly the same at the end by these red arrows. It all is just sort of a mess. The pace definitely comes at the beginning portion of the race. That is a trend that I have seen in every single Grand Prix that I have analysed. That first stint, that is where we see the most differentiation. And then come the second stint, there's potentially a little bit. And then the third stint, it's just non-existent. Everybody is running at the same pace. But now what we can do is we can isolate each driver's clean air lap running. And then we end up with a leaderboard that looks a little bit like this. Over the entire Grand Prix, Sergio Perez, with this average lap time here, was rated as the fastest driver in clean air. With, if you notice, Valtteri Bottas is then the 3rd fastest car, half a second down. The Red Bulls were clear. Now just a small explanation for this clean air lap algorithm overall. So to identify each clean air lap, I basically exclude any lap that was set within 2.5 seconds of the driver in front. That is the variable that I have set for Austria. Now this obviously pulls up a whole bunch of lap times. Now I don't want every single one, as there are going to be a couple of outliers. So I do go through a small truncation period. And straight away we remove lap number 1. We remove the last lap. We remove any pit stops, any VSCs, any safety cars, any red flags, mistakes, anything like that. So we are just left with a bunch of competitive lap times. Then from those competitive lap times, manually, I then remove any incidents where there is a car being lapped, or you are then lapping another car as well. Then finally from that list, I will then remove the bottom 25%, so the slowest 25% of the clean air lap times, and the fastest 2. And then we are left with a nice middle range which I can average, and that is the average which is on screen now, which has Sergio Perez as the fastest. Then we have the gap column, and then we have the percentage gap column as well. Now this middle column is the most important. This allows me to compare the pace across each Grand Prix. Then we have the number of clean air laps that each driver sets. This is after the truncation period. So Sergio Perez set 16 overall compared to Max Verstappen's 50, which was 70% of the overall Grand Prix, which is this percentage column on the right. And then finally, we have the standard deviation column across those clean air laps. Now, like I said in the last week's edition, I am looking at changing the standard deviation column to the overall gradient, as we would like to see a improvement, which is a negative gradient. The more negative, the better improvement you are making. But if we take a look at that percentage column in the middle and we average it to the 8 previous races that we've had so far, we end up with a table that looks a bit like this. Now, obviously Max Verstappen hasn't been the fastest car in clean air in all of the Grand Prix, so what I've done is I've simply just subtracted Max Verstappen's original percentage, which I believe he was at about 0.2 or something like that, just to set Max Verstappen as the benchmark. And then obviously that was subtracted from every single person as well. So across this whole season, it is the 2 Red Bulls who are very, very rapid this whole season. Then Lewis Hamilton is close behind, and Valtteri Bottas is declared P4, with Pierre Gasly now P5 ahead of Norris, who is joint with Sainz. And then doing exactly the same for the teams, Red Bull have extended their pace advantage over Mercedes. Now this gap, this 0.36% gap between the top 2 teams, is similar to the pace gap that we saw in 2014 with Mercedes. So this is an extremely dominant pace year for Red Bull. And then just visualizing where each of these clean air laps after the truncation period popped up for each of the drivers, we can see that for Lando Norris and also Max Verstappen, and a couple of laps for Valtteri Bottas, there were some in that first opening stint when everybody is high on fuel. As for everybody else, they all come in the final 65-70% of the Grand Prix. Now, in order to discount the levels of fuel, I have done exactly the same clean air lap analysis for each stint. So here is stint number 1. The soft drivers are on the left, the medium drivers are on the right, and we'll take a look at the hard runners in just a little moment. Drivers with a bracketed asterisk by their name didn't set any clean air laps, any competitive clean air laps, within their stint. However, they did run that tyre. And we can see that for stint 1 on that medium compound of tyre, Verstappen was 0.3 faster than anybody else. Then they had Hamilton, Bottas and Norris all within 1.5 tenths of each other. Then there was a 0.5 second gap to Daniel Ricciardo. And if I just slide this table along to take a look at the 2 hard compound of tyre runners, again Giovinazzi didn't set any clean air laps. We have Carlos Sainz and Kimi Räikkönen. And then for stint number 2, it looks a little bit like this. We didn't have any soft compound tyre runners in stint 2, just 2 mediums, Sainz and Räikkönen, and everybody else was on the hards. And this was probably where Max Verstappen just slowed down a little bit. He just knocked the pace back as he was comfortably leading, as it was Sergio Perez who was 0.3 faster than Max Verstappen in clean air, and Valtteri Bottas and Lando Norris were about 1.5 tenths away from each other. But we can see Lewis Hamilton slower than Fernando Alonso. This is at the point where he picked up that damage, which cost him about 0.5 second per lap, which would have put him in P2. Obviously, if you were to believe Mercedes' claim that the damage did cost him 0.5 second per lap, but that is up to you. Then finally, we have a couple of stint 3 runners, only a few: Gasly, Vettel, Tsunoda, Stroll, Hamilton and Mazepin. And here once again we can see that Hamilton is struggling, as he is not able to even go as quickly as Pierre Gasly. And so with that clean air lap analysis all done and dusted for the entire Grand Prix and also all of the stints, we're now going to break down each of the teams. We are going in 2020 championship order. We'll start with Mercedes and we'll end with Williams. I will take a little bit of time to explain each of the graphs that are about to pop up in the Mercedes section. So taking a look at the Mercedes panel on screen now, we'll start in the top left. This is the lap time charts for the 2 Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton in the black and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise. Now the grey dotted line is their previous pace at the Styrian Grand Prix of 2021. Then the graph directly below that is the Mercedes gaps chart. This shows the gap between each of the cars on every single lap. Again, Lewis Hamilton is the black when he was in front, and then the turquoise is when Valtteri Bottas was in front. Then the graph in the top right is their positional chart, where each driver was positioned on which lap of the race. And then in the bottom right, we have the percentage pace difference. This takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times and divides them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times. It then converts them to a percentage and orders these percentages from highest down to lowest. Any percentage that is above 100 is when Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and then any percentage that is below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. And the easy thing that we can do with this is split this down the middle, and we can see that for 57.7% of the laps raced, it was Valtteri Bottas who was going faster, and then for 42.3% it was Lewis Hamilton. So that damage was really costing Lewis Hamilton, but to what extent, I don't think we will ever know. And in stint number 1, they were exceptionally even. And both equally very inconsistent. We can see Lewis Hamilton not setting any consistent lap times, whereas Valtteri Bottas could string together 1 or 2, and then he would either slow down or speed up, whereas Lewis Hamilton was very uppy-downy, heart monitor-y-esque. They then both come in for their pit stops at pretty much the same point in time, and then obviously Lewis Hamilton has to take his second pit stop, mainly, I'm not sure why, actually. It wasn't damage related, it wasn't really tyre wear related, I'm not 100% sure why he took that second stop. But he did overall, and he wasn't even able to go faster than Valtteri Bottas post pit stop. But what we can do now is just analyse the clean air lap pace of the two Mercedes cars, and we can compare it to their 2021 pace, in which their 2021 pace on average was 1/10 slower than Valtteri Bottas's pace. And then the clean air lap running for stint number 1 for the two Mercedes, they were just even. 0.06 between the two drivers on that medium compound of tyre. And then stint number 2, this was where Hamilton had the damage, and the gap rose to 0.4 in Bottas's favour. Now, I'm not going to bother including stint number 3 for Lewis Hamilton, as Valtteri Bottas did not do a stint number 3. So from Mercedes, we will now take a look at Red Bull, and we can split this percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for just 7% of the laps raced, Sergio Perez in the darker line was the faster of the two Red Bulls, and for 93% it was Max Verstappen. This is the largest teammate difference of the entire season. I said this last week when we had a 88-12 split with McLaren in favour of Lando Norris, but this has now been overtaken by 93-7. And we can see an absolutely enormous 2-second per lap gap between the two drivers. For the first 16 laps, the gap rose at the start of the Grand Prix to 40 seconds in just 20 laps. Now, this gap between the two drivers allowed both Red Bulls to come into the pits on the same lap, which is why where their pit stops are on the lap chart, we don't see any change in the gap whatsoever on the gaps chart, as they both came in on the same lap. Then post pit stop, the gap was probably 2, maybe 0.3 of a second, again in Max Verstappen's favour. And that rose the gap all the way up to 60 seconds to an entire minute on raw pace. And then finally we have that Max Verstappen pit stop just because he could, and he had that gap over everybody, and that dropped the gap to 40 seconds. However, he managed to raise this back up to 50 at the checkered flag. But now if we take a look at the Red Bull's pace and compare it to Styria, they were actually 4.5 faster than they were in Styria last week, compared to Mercedes being just 1/10 faster overall. With stint number 1 looking a bit like this, Sergio Perez not actually setting any competitive clean air laps within stint number 1, and then stint number 2, like I said, Verstappen probably just came off the throttle as Perez was still battling in that midfield group, with the gap between the two drivers being 0.3. And so from Red Bull and the enormous pace deficit between Verstappen and Perez, we'll take a look at McLaren. And again, splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 12.7% of the Grand Prix, it was Daniel Ricciardo in blue, who was the faster car, and then for 87.3%, it was Lando Norris. Once again, even though it was a better Grand Prix for Daniel Ricciardo, an enormous pace difference. 87-13, rather than 88-12. Where just like the Red Bull graph, we can see an enormous over 1 second a lap gap between the two drivers, which escalates the gap from the start of the Grand Prix to 25 seconds in just 20 laps. However, they are very fairly even about 5 laps before the pit stops, where Daniel Ricciardo comes in first, and then just 1 lap after it is Lando Norris, where the gap just spikes a little bit. However, post pit stop, it is Lando Norris who takes full advantage of his fresh tyre compounds and is about 4/10, maybe 3/10 a lap faster than Daniel Ricciardo, and then Ricciardo manages to close this down to probably being about 2/10 behind overall. Then we can take a look at the McLaren's pace and we can compare it to 2021. They were half a second quicker, much like Red Bull. They were half a second quicker than they were last week. With stint number 1 for the two McLarens looking a bit like this in clean air, Ricciardo was 4/10 down on the medium compound of tyre to Lando Norris. However, for stint number 2, when they went to the hards, Ricciardo was able to close this down to 1/10 of a second. So he definitely got more comfortable as the Grand Prix went on, which showed as he was able to finish a solid P7. Then from McLaren, we will take a look at Aston Martin, and splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 46.4% it was Lance Stroll in the pink who was going faster, and therefore for 53.6% it was Sebastian Vettel. So overall, a very, very even split, with the two drivers setting pretty much identical lap times in an identical trend on their soft tyre running. The gap was kept at about a second per lap. It was Lance Stroll in the pink who then came in for his pit stop first, about a couple of laps, 3 or 4 laps before Sebastian Vettel. Then post pit stop they were once again extremely even, with Lance Stroll admittedly being a little bit more consistent than Sebastian Vettel up until lap 36 and 44, where we have two small little peaks for some reason. I'm not 100% sure why. They then come in for their second round of pit stops, with again Lance Stroll coming in before Sebastian Vettel, and then post pit stop very, very even once again. With the overall lap times of the Aston Martins compared to last week looking a bit like this, they were a full second quicker than they were last week, which is absolutely astonishing to gain 1 second from the times that they set last week. Bearing in mind we're just 1 step softer in the compounds, which Pirelli equates that to be, about half a second, maybe 7/10 of a second. They've actually found some pace from 1 week to another. With stint number 1 looking a bit like this, both drivers not setting any clean air lap times, so we will take a look at stint number 2 on the hard compound of tyre. There was 2/10 of a difference between the two drivers in Sebastian Vettel's favour. However, in stint number 3, again both on the hard compound of tyres, Stroll was able to close this down to just under a tenth. Both drivers exceptionally even. Then from Aston Martin we will take a look at Alpine, and there's nothing that we can compare as Ocon never set any laps. However, what we can do is take a look at Alonso's pace compared to last week, and just like Aston Martin, they were a full second quicker than their pace last week. With Alonso's stint 1 time not being classified as he didn't set any clean air laps in stint number 1, and stint number 2, it was a 109.143 on the hards. However, we have no benchmark to Esteban Ocon. So from Alpine, we'll take a look at Ferrari. And we'll split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 49.3% it was Carlos Sainz in the black that was the faster car, and for 50.7% of the race it was Charles Leclerc who was the faster of the two Ferraris. An even more even split than what we saw with the Aston Martins, with the two Ferraris being exceptionally even in the first 16 or so laps, with the gap hovering at around 2 seconds. However, both drivers managed to step up their lap times progressively in this first stint. They were averaging around 71 seconds per lap around lap 12, and then at lap 20 they were averaging 70 seconds, so they managed to pull an entire second whilst both being extremely close together. It was then Charles Leclerc who came in first, as Carlos Sainz was on an alternate strategy on the hard compound of tyre first, which rose the gap in Sainz's favour. Then post Carlos Sainz pit stop, he was absolutely rapid. At some points he was a second per lap quicker than Charles Leclerc, and they actually did a swap. They actually did a team order swap at the end of the Grand Prix. But taking a look at Ferrari's lap times overall and comparing them to their 2021 Styrian pace last week, they were just a tenth faster than their Styrian Grand Prix pace. So where we saw Alpine and Aston Martin gaining a second, McLaren and Red Bull gaining half a second, and Mercedes just a handful of tenths, Ferrari gain under a tenth. With their stint 1 pace looking a little bit like this, Sainz actually on the slower tyre, going 0.3 a lap faster, where Pirelli projected there to be a half a second difference between the hard and the medium. With stint number 2 looking a little bit like this, Sainz on the mediums and Leclerc on the hards, however, he never set a competitive lap time on the hards. So from Ferrari, we will now take a look at Alfa Tauri. And splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 18.6% of the Grand Prix, Tsunoda in the white was the faster of the two cars, and for 81.4% it was Pierre Gasly. With much like the Aston Martins and the Ferraris before them, both drivers starting on the softs were exceptionally even, up until their first round of pit stops, where it was actually Yuki Tsunoda who pitted just a lap before Pierre Gasly. Then post pit stop, we can see that Gasly was just the slightly more consistent and slightly quicker of the two Alfa Tauri cars, which rose the gap to about 10 seconds at the point of their second stop, where Gasly came in significantly earlier than Yuki Tsunoda. And then post Tsunoda's pit stop, the gap again was fairly consistent. With the Alfa Tauri lap times looking a little bit like this, they went a mammoth 1.1 seconds per lap faster than they did last week, and that all came in that final stint from Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda. With stint number 1, neither driver setting any competitive clean air lap times on the softs, so we'll take a look at stint number 2, where they were both on the hards, and there was just a half a tenth difference between the two drivers. However, in stint number 3, the gap rose to about 4 tenths, again in Gasly's favour. Then from Alfa Tauri, we'll take a look at Alfa Romeo. And splitting this percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 32.9% of the Grand Prix, it was Antonio Giovinazzi in the white, who was the faster of the two cars, and for 67.1%, it was Kimi Räikkönen. With the two drivers being relatively even in that first opening stint, however, the gap did steadily rise in Räikkönen's favour to about 10 seconds, up until we got to the first round of pit stops, where Giovinazzi again came in significantly earlier than Kimi Räikkönen. Then post Räikkönen pit stop, we actually have a very big mistake from Giovinazzi. I'm not entirely sure what this was, because this wasn't a second pit stop. It was about a 75 second lap time, 76 second lap time overall, so a 1 minute 15, where they were averaging around 1 minute 10s. So I'm not entirely sure what that was. Then, of course, the big steep line at lap 69 is when Räikkönen came together with Sebastian Vettel. And then taking a look at the overall Alfa Romeo lap times and comparing it to last week, they were again, like Red Bull and McLaren, half a second faster than they were last week. With the overall difference between the two drivers in clean air across the whole race being just over a tenth of a second. With the stint number 1 pace looking a bit like this, both drivers on the hard compound of tyre, however Giovinazzi not setting any competitive lap times. Then stint number 2, they actually split the strategies. Giovinazzi went onto the hards, and then Räikkönen went onto the faster mediums. However, in clean air, Räikkönen was not able to go faster than Giovinazzi. He was just under a tenth of a second slower, where there is again projected by Pirelli to be a half a second difference between the two tyre compounds. Then from Alfa Romeo, we will penultimately take a look at Haas. Then splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 33.3% of the Grand Prix, it was Nikita Mazepin who was going faster than Mick Schumacher in the white, and then for 66.7%, it was Mick Schumacher in the grey who was going faster. With both drivers in the first stint being exceptionally even, there was almost nothing to separate them whatsoever. The gap was staying at around 1 second to 2 seconds for about 15 to 16 laps. However, it all starts to change when we come in for the first round of pit stops. It was Mazepin who came in first around lap 28, and then Mick Schumacher came in about 5 or 6 laps after. And it is here that we see a fairly significant pace chunk between the two drivers, where Mick Schumacher comes onto his fresh tyres, he's about half a second a lap faster than Nikita Mazepin. However, what I didn't realise is Mazepin came in for a second pit stop overall, which rose the gap all the way to 40 seconds. Then as we can see for both drivers from laps 52 to the end of the Grand Prix, they are both hampered and absolutely mullered by the blue flags, where the gap is all sorts of wiggly and the lap times are just even more wiggly. But taking a look at the lap times of the two Haas cars, we can see that their pace was again half a second quicker. So pretty much everybody, apart from Mercedes, then Alfa Tauri, Aston Martin and Alpine, gained roughly half a second on their last week's pace, with there being half a second between the two drivers in clean air across the entire Grand Prix. However, across stint number 1 on the medium compound of tyre, it was 6.5 tenths in Mick Schumacher's favour. And then on the hards on stint 2, it got even worse. It was 8 tenths in Mick Schumacher's favour. And then finally, we'll take a look at Williams. And splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 21.4% of the Grand Prix, it was Nicholas Latifi in blue who was going faster than George Russell. He was going faster for 78.6% of the Grand Prix, with once again both drivers, much like the Haas, being exceptionally even in that first opening stint, with admittedly George Russell having the edge over Nicholas Latifi by about a tenth per lap. Both drivers come in for their pit stops, again George just a little bit earlier than Nicholas Latifi. However, there is that enormous position difference, let alone pace difference. There is just an enormous position difference between the two drivers. Then post Nicholas Latifi pit stop, it is George Russell who is just consistently about 2 or 3 tenths a lap quicker than Nicholas Latifi, which raises the gap post pit stop from about 15 seconds to all the way up to 30 at the checkered flag. And then taking a look at the overall Williams lap times and comparing it to last week, they were 1.2 seconds per lap faster than they were in Styria, with Russell being about 4 tenths a lap faster than Latifi overall. With stint number 1 looking a bit like this, there being a half a second, just under half a second gap between Russell and Latifi, both on the medium compound of tyre. Then they both went on to the hards, and Latifi actually closed this down a little bit to 2.5 tenths, but he was still just a little bit behind. And there we go, there is all of the race data concluded for the Austrian Grand Prix. Once again, apologies for this being just that little bit late. But if there is anything that you have any questions about all of this data, then please let me know in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to answer all of your questions. But please let me know as well, what was your favourite bit about this Grand Prix? But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.